dust does not fall the way rain does. It hangs. It waits in the flat orange light of a July afternoon and settles onto everything with the patience of something that knows it will outlast you. And on the last unbroken field of the Rehnquist place, a young woman knelt in it up to her wrists, letting the powder run through her fingers and studying it the way another person might study a letter from someone long dead. She was not planting. There was nothing to plant. The corn had failed in June, and the sorghum had failed after it, and the county extension man had already driven the gravel of Colwood Road twice that summer to tell the holdouts what the satellites had told him, which was that the drought had a name now and a duration, and that the smart money had already sold what stock it had and gone to work in the propane depots down in Halvern. But Delphine Rehnquist was not looking at the dust as a defeat. She was looking at it as a substance. She lifted a handful to her nose and smelled the iron in it, and the old smell underneath that. The mineral smell that her grandfather used to say was the field breathing out what it had breathed in over 100 years, and she thought, not for the first time, that everyone driving past had decided what this ground was worth before they had ever stopped to hold it. They were certain, those men. That was the thing about them she had come to understand. Old Brant Hurley from the co-op leaned on the fence one evening with his elbows hooked over the top wire and told her plainly that she was wasting the last daylight of her youth on 11 acres of powder that would not grow a weed, that her grandfather had been a stubborn fool to keep it when the syndicate offered to buy in '89, and that the kindest thing she could do for herself was to let the bank have it and go be young somewhere with water. He said it not cruelly. He said it the way a man reads a thermometer. And Delphine, who had learned from her grandmother that the loudest certainty is usually the shallowest, only nodded and kept sifting the dust between her fingers, because she had noticed something in it that morning that she did not yet have a word for, and she had decided she would rather be quietly wrong for a season than loudly agreeable forever. If you have ever been told that the thing you have in your hands is not worth the trouble, do me a small favor and press the like button so this story reaches somebody else who needs to hear where it goes. And then tell me down in the comments the name of the town you are watching from right now, because I read every one of them and I like to know exactly where in the world these stories are landing. Now let me take you back to the beginning, to how a girl with no plan and a dead man's notebook came to turn the one thing the whole county had written off into the only harvest anybody talked about for years. She had not meant to come back at all. Delphine was 23 the spring her grandfather Alvin died, and she had been living in a rented room above a laundromat in Kansas City, working nights coding shift logs for a freight company and telling herself she was passing through on the way to somewhere with her name on it. She had left Rehnquist ground at 18 the way most people her age left, which was quickly and without a backward glance, believing that the flatness behind her held nothing but the slow erosion of everyone who stayed. When the call came that Alvin had gone in his sleep, she drove the 4 hours west with the intention of settling the estate in a weekend and being back at her desk by Monday. She did not know then that some places do not let you settle them in a weekend. She did not know that the house would still smell like his coffee and his machine oil, or that his boots would still be by the door with the left one worn down harder than the right because of the knee, or that the county would assume, the moment her tires hit the gravel, that she had come to sell. The Rehnquist place sat at the dry western edge of Sparen County, a stretch of Nebraska tableland where the shelter belts had thinned to gray skeletons and the creeks that fed the low ground had gone to memory. 11 acres of Alvin's original quarter still stood in the family name. The rest had been sold off in pieces across the decades, each sale a small surrender that Delphine's mother had made from far away, and that Alvin had resented in silence until the resentment became simply the shape of him. What was left was the homestead, a windmill that no longer turned, a collapsing barn the color of a bruise, and that one last field that everyone, including the bank, had agreed was finished. The soil there was strange. It always had been. Where the neighbors ran a rich, dark loam that took Corn like a sponge takes water, the Rehnquist field ran pale and gritty and full of a fine chalky clay that the extension men had classified decades ago as marginal, and Alvin himself had spent 40 years fighting it, cursing it, and losing to it a little more each dry year. It was, by every measure anyone had ever applied, the worst ground in the county, and it was hers now. Her grandmother Ottilie was the one who told her not to sign anything. Ottilie was 81 that spring and lived in the small house at the near end of the property, a woman built like a fence post and about as inclined to bend, who wore the same canvas coat in April that she wore in November, because she had bought it in 1974 and saw no reason to insult a coat that still worked. She had buried a husband and 2 brothers and had watched the syndicate buy up half of Sparen County one drought at a time, and she spoke rarely, and when she spoke, she did not waste the words on comfort. Delphine sat with her at the kitchen table the day after the funeral, the sale papers from the bank between them like a third guest nobody wanted, and Ottilia looked at the papers for a long time and then looked at her granddaughter and said, "They always want the dirt cheapest right when they've convinced everyone it's dirt." That was all. She got up and put the kettle on and did not raise the subject again. But Delphine did not sign the papers that day, and she did not sign them the next, and something in her that had been asleep since she was 18 turned over and opened one eye. What made her stay, in the end, was not a plan. She would say that for the rest of her life, and it was true. It was a notebook. She found it while clearing the roll-top desk in Alvin's front room, a black cloth-bound ledger swollen with damp and use, its spine held together with a rubber band gone brittle with age, and inside it, in her grandfather's cramped and slanting hand, 40 years of the field. Not just yields and rainfall, though those were there in dense columns. There were observations she did not at first understand, entries that had nothing to do with farming as she knew it. 3rd week of June, the dust off the west acre tastes of chalk and something sweet. September, the pale ground holds heat past midnight, where the loam gives it up by 10. And on a page near the back, underlined twice, a line that would come to organize the rest of her life without her knowing it yet. A line her grandfather had written and never explained to a living soul. The wrong soil is only wrong for the wrong crop. She read that line under the bare bulb of the front room at 2 in the morning, with the wind pushing grit against the windows, and she did not understand it, and she could not stop thinking about it. It sat in her like a seed she had swallowed. She began carrying the notebook everywhere, out to the field in the mornings, back to the house at night, and she started a notebook of her own, a spiral one from the drugstore in the county seat, in which she copied the parts of Alvin's records she could not decipher and added her own observations beside them. And she found that the act of looking closely at a thing everyone else had stopped looking at was the first thing in years that had made her feel like she was standing on solid ground. The field was pale and gritty and mineral and dry. Everyone agreed it was worthless, and her grandfather, who had fought it for 40 years, had written on the last page not that it was worthless, but that it was wrong for the wrong crop. Which meant, if she followed the grammar of it all the way down, that there was a right crop, and that he had died before he found it, and that the finding had been left, like the field itself, to her. The men at the co-op found out she was staying before she had decided it herself, which was the way of information in Sparen County. Delphine walked into Merle Gaddy's Feed and Hardware on Colwood Road the 2nd week of April to buy fence staples and a soil probe, and the conversation among the 4 men leaning on the counter did not stop so much as reroot itself around her, the way water reroots around a stone it has no interest in moving. Merle himself, a soft-voiced man with an accountant's caution and a genuine kindness under it, rang up her staples and asked, gently, whether she'd be needing seed corn this year or whether she was just tidying up before the sale. And when she said neither, that she was staying, the silence behind her had a texture to it. It was Brant Hurley who put the words to what the silence was thinking. He was the largest landowner between there and the Halvern line, a man whose grandfather had bought cheap in the 30s and whose family had been buying cheap ever since. And he was not a cruel man, but he was a certain one. And certainty in a man like that is its own kind of weather. He turned on his stool and looked at Delphine with something between pity and impatience and said, "That ground of Alvin's never grew a full crop in 50 years, honey, and it won't start for you." He said, "You can pour every dollar and every hour you've got into that pale dirt, and at the end of it you'll have exactly what your granddad had, which is dust and a mortgage." He said, "That field doesn't lead anywhere. It never has." And then he turned back to his coffee, having offered these things not as insults, but as facts for her consideration, the way you might warn a stranger that a bridge is out ahead. Delphine paid for her staples and her soil probe, and she did not argue with him, because her grandmother had taught her that arguing with certainty only feeds it, and because she had nothing yet to argue with, no proof, no crop, no name for the thing in the dust. She drove home on Culwood Road with the windows down and the pale fields streaming past on either side, the good loam of the Hurley ground dark and promising and already planted, the Rehnquist ground ahead of her the color of bone. And she thought about the line in the notebook, and she thought, all right. If it is wrong for the wrong crop, then I will spend as long as it takes finding out what it is right for, and I will not tell anyone what I am doing until the ground itself tells me. Because a thing has to be true before it's worth saying, and the field has been trying to say something true for 100 years, and no one has been quiet enough to hear it. She began, that April, with the only tools she had, which were patience and attention and a soil probe. Every morning before the heat came, she walked the 11 acres in a slow grid, pushing the probe down and pulling up cores and laying them out on a board on the porch to dry. And she photographed them and weighed them and tasted them, actually tasted them, touching a wet fingertip to the pale grit the way her grandfather's notebook told her he had, and she found that Alvin had been right, that the west acre ran sweet and the low corner ran bitter with something metallic, and the middle was chalk almost all the way down. She sent samples to the state lab in an envelope she could barely afford to mail, and when the results came back in a manila folder 3 weeks later, she sat on the porch steps and read them and felt the top of her scalp go cold. The lab had reported the numbers as a warning. High in calcium carbonate, they said. Excessive mineral content, low organic matter, poor for row crops, unsuitable for standard forage. The extension man would have read that page and told her to sell. But Delphine, holding it, kept coming back to the words high in calcium carbonate and excessive mineral, and a phrase near the bottom that the lab had included almost as an afterthought, a note that the pale clay carried an unusually high concentration of dissolved minerals native to the ancient seabed that had lain there before the plains were plains. And she thought of the notebook, tastes of chalk and something sweet, and she went inside and did not sleep, and by morning she had the beginning of an idea that she was almost afraid to hold. The idea was not corn. It was not sorghum or soybeans or any of the things the good loam wanted, the things the whole county measured worth by. The idea came to her sideways, the way the best ones do, out of a memory of her grandmother. Adelia kept goats, 3 of them, mean old things she milked by hand and made a hard, tangy cheese from that Delphine had grown up eating without thinking about it. And the summer Delphine was small, she remembered Ottilie complaining that the goats that grazed the pale field gave milk that tasted different, sharper, minerally, that the cheese from that milk set harder and kept longer, and that Ottilie's own mother had prized it and called it stone cheese and sold it to a French cook who came through with the railroad crews in the 20s. Delphine had not thought of stone cheese in 15 years, but she thought of it now, sitting with the lab report, and she thought, the minerals go into the plants, and the plants go into the milk, and the milk carries the field. And she opened her grandfather's notebook to a page she had passed over a dozen times, a page where Alvin had written, in the dry summer of 1994, "The goats favor the West Acre," and Ottilie's mother would have known why. And Delphine understood that the knowledge she needed was not in a lab or an extension office. It had been in the family the whole time. It had been in the field the whole time. It had simply been waiting for someone patient enough to be told. She did not rush. That was the thing that later made people describe her the way they did, half in admiration and half in bafflement, because in a county that measured a man by how fast he could get a crop in and a check out, Delphine Rehnquist moved like the seasons themselves. She spent the rest of that first spring not buying goats, but reading about them, and reading about the plants that grew on poor mineral ground in the dry parts of the world. And she learned that in the limestone hills of southern Europe and the high dry plateaus of the Near East, farmers had grazed animals on exactly the kind of pale, calcareous ground everyone in Sparen County had written off, and that the cheeses and the meat that came from those places were not cheap commodities sold by the ton, but rare things sold by the ounce, prized precisely because the poor ground gave them a flavor that rich ground could not. She learned that the drought and the chalk and the mineral load, all the things the lab had listed as defects, were the exact conditions under which certain hardy plants concentrated their oils and certain grazing animals produced milk of extraordinary character. She learned, in short, that her grandfather had been half right and had died before finishing the sentence. The soil was not wrong for the wrong crop. It was gloriously, specifically, valuably right for a crop that no one within 400 miles had ever thought to want. Ottilie watched all this from the small house at the end of the property with the flat, unreadable patience of a woman who had seen enthusiasms come and go. When Delphine finally came to her in the middle of that first summer and said she wanted to build a herd, real dairy goats, hardy breeds that would thrive on the pale ground, and that she wanted to learn to make the cheese, the stone cheese, the way Ottilia's mother had, the old woman did not smile and did not encourage her. She set down the sock she was darning and looked at her granddaughter for a long moment, and then she said, "That cheese killed my mother's back and made her almost no money, and everyone told her it was a waste of good milk." She said it flatly, as a fact for consideration, the same register Brant Hurley used at the co-op, and Delphine's heart dropped, and then Ottilie added, after a silence in which the clock on the wall ticked 11 times, but the ones who tasted it never forgot it. And then she picked up her darning again, and that was the whole of her blessing, and it was enough. She had withheld the praise and offered the belief in the same breath, which was the only way she knew how to give anything, and Delphine understood it. And the next morning the two of them drove 90 miles east to a farm that was dispersing its herd. And Delphine spent nearly the last of Alvin's small insurance money on 9 bred does and 1 cantankerous buck the seller warned her about, a rangy gray animal with a torn ear and an expression of permanent disappointment. And on the drive home, Ottilie looked at the buck in the trailer through the back window and said, "That one thinks the whole world owes him an apology." And Delphine laughed for the first time since the funeral and named the buck comptroller, because he acted like he was auditing everyone he met, and the name stuck for the rest of his long and disagreeable life. The first year nearly broke her, and this is the part the county did not see because Delphine did not let them see it. She fenced the pale field herself over 6 weeks of blistered hands, digging post holes into the chalk clay that turned to concrete in the sun, and she built shelter for the goats out of the salvaged lumber of the bruise-colored barn. And she learned by trial and repeated humiliating error how to milk an animal that had opinions about being milked, and she failed at cheese. She failed at it for months. Her first batches were sour, then rubbery, then so hard they could have been used as door stops, and she wept over a curdled pot at midnight more than once and thought about the freight desk in Kansas City with its clean fluorescent certainty and no living thing depending on her getting it right. But she kept the notebook. Every failure went into the notebook beside her grandfather's entries, the temperature and the timing and the taste, and slowly the failures began to teach her, the way failures do when you refuse to look away from them. And by the end of that first winter, she made a wheel of cheese from the West Acre milk that sat hard and pale and tasted, when she finally cut into it in the cold kitchen with Ottilie watching, of chalk and something sweet, exactly the words in the notebook, exactly the taste her grandfather had recorded from the dust itself, the field arriving at last in a form a person could hold in their hand. Ottilie tasted it and chewed slowly and did not say it was good. She said, "That's my mother's cheese." And she put the rest of the wedge in her coat pocket and walked home in the dark. And Delphine stood in the kitchen and understood that she had crossed some line that could not be uncrossed, that the field had finally said its true thing, and that now the only task left, which would take years, was getting the world quiet enough to hear it. She did not advertise. She had no money to advertise with and no instinct for it besides. And she had come to believe, watching how the county talked, that a thing announced too loudly is a thing distrusted. So she let the cheese introduce itself the slow way, the only way she trusted. She took 3 wheels to the county seat that first spring and left them on consignment at the little grocery on Delph Street, run by a widow named Rosalind Tackett, who was skeptical and who priced them high because Delphine insisted, higher than any cheese had a right to be in Sparen County, and who called Delphine within the week to say the 3 wheels were gone and to ask, in a voice that had shed its skepticism entirely, how many more she could get. The people who bought them were not local at first. They were passing through, a woman driving to Denver who tasted a sample cube on a toothpick and turned around at the door to buy the other 2 wheels whole, a retired chef down from Omaha visiting his sister who ate a slice standing in the aisle and then drove out Culwood Road unannounced to find the source, which was how Delphine came home from milking one April evening to find a heavy-set man in his 60s standing at her fence in a good coat, staring at the pale field the way she had stared at it a year before. And when she asked if she could help him, he said, without turning around, "This is the wrong ground for cheese like that," which is exactly why it isn't. He introduced himself as Present Vasco, which was a strange name that turned out to be a shortened family name he never fully explained, and he had cooked in cities she had only read about, and he stood at her fence for an hour asking questions no one in the county had thought to ask, about the minerals and the plants and the breed of the goats and the age of the caves she aged the cheese in, which were not caves at all, but the old root cellar under the homestead where the pale clay walls held the cool and the damp at exactly the level the cheese wanted, another gift of the wrong ground that had turned out to be right. Before he left, he bought everything she had and told her he would be back, and he was. And it was through Present Vasco, who could not stop talking about the stone cheese to every chef he knew, that the slow word began to move in earnest. By the second summer, the drought that had ruined the county had deepened into something the newspapers gave a decade to, and the irony of it was not lost on anyone who thought about it, though few did at first. The Hurley corn came up thin and burned brown by July. The good dark loam that everyone measured worth by cracked and blue, and the syndicate that owned half of Sparen County let field after field go fallow because there was no water to justify the seed. And out on the pale bone-colored 11 acres that the extension man had condemned, Delphine's herd, which thrived on the hardy dry ground plants that needed almost no rain and drew their character up out of the mineral chalk, went on giving milk of extraordinary flavor while the rest of the county went dry, because the very quality that had made the ground worthless for corn, its refusal to hold water, its chalk, its mineral load, was the quality that made it perfect for the animals and the plants she had matched to it. She was, by the end of that second summer, running the only operation on the west end of Sparen County that was producing anything anyone wanted to buy. The men at the co-op noticed. They could not help noticing, and the noticing, at first, took the form not of respect, but of a kind of aggrieved bewilderment, an insistence that it was a fluke, that it wouldn't last, that a person couldn't build anything real out of a handful of goats and some hard cheese, And it was Brant Hurley again who said the thing they were all thinking, this time to Merle at the counter, with Delphine standing near enough to hear, that the girl had gotten lucky in a bad year, and that luck in a bad year is the worst kind, because it convinces you to keep doing the fool thing when the rain comes back. And that come the rain, her little cheese business would go the way of every clever notion that ever came out of that pale ground, which was nowhere. Delphine took her staples to the counter and paid for them, and on her way out she stopped, which she rarely did, and she said to Brant, not unkindly, that she didn't need it to rain. She said it plainly, the way Otley would have. She said, "The rain is your worry, Mr. Hurley, not mine. And the ground you all felt sorry for is the only ground out here that doesn't care whether it rains or not." And she left him with that, a fact offered for his consideration, and she drove home and did not think about him again, because she had learned that the surest way to lose a season was to spend it looking backward at the men who doubted you. But the thing she had said sat in the co-op like a stone dropped in still water, and it spread, and by fall there were men on the West End, quietly reading up on dry ground grazing and pale calcareous soil. Men who had spent their lives certain that the Rehnquist field was the worst ground in the county, and who were beginning, in the privacy of their own trucks, to wonder whether it might be the best ground for the world the drought was actually making, rather than the world they wished they still had. The growth, when it came the way she wanted it to come, which was slowly and by hand, and pulled forward by demand rather than pushed forward by debt. Present Vasco carried wheels back to the city and put the stone cheese on tasting menus at restaurants whose names Delphine could not pronounce. And the chefs there put it in front of writers, and one of the writers put a paragraph about it in a food magazine that Rosalind Tackett found out about before Delphine did, because Rosalind read everything, and the paragraph called it the taste of a place that shouldn't exist, aged in the very drought that killed everything around it. And after that, the orders came faster than Delphine could fill them, which was exactly the pressure she had promised herself she would resist. She could have borrowed against the land and bought 200 goats and built a stainless steel facility and become, in 3 years, the kind of operation the syndicate would want to buy. Everyone told her to. The bank, which 2 years earlier had wanted her to sell, now wanted very much to lend, and a man from an agricultural investment fund drove all the way out Colwood Road in a car that had never seen gravel to offer her capital and expansion and a national brand, and Delphine listened to him politely at the kitchen table with Ottilie darning in the corner and the black notebook on the table between them, and when he was finished she said no. She said it the way she had said no to the sale papers 2 years before, quietly and without drama. And when he asked her why, sincerely baffled, she said that the cheese was good because the herd was small enough that she knew every animal, and the field was small enough that she knew every acre, and that if she made 200 wheels a week, she would be making a different cheese and calling it the same name, which was a kind of lie she was not willing to tell. The man from the fund left confused, believing he had met either a fool or a saint, and Ottilie, who had not looked up from her darning, said after his car had faded down the road, "Your grandfather would have signed that paper," and Delphine said, "I know," and Ottilie said, and regretted it every day after, which was the closest that woman ever came to saying she was proud. Instead of borrowing, Delphine grew the way the field grew, one careful increment at a time, adding a few does each year only when she had first found the pasture to feed them and the hands to help her milk them, and the hands, when they came from the town in a way that knit the whole thing back into the place it had grown out of. The first was a boy named Torvald Acre, 16 and quiet and treated by the county as slow because he did not speak much and preferred animals to people, whose father ran him off the family place every summer as useless, and who wandered out to Delphine's fence one June day and stood watching the goats for 2 hours without a word, and Delphine, recognizing something of herself in the watching, handed him a bucket and said nothing, and he stayed. He had a gift with the animals that bordered on the uncanny. The goats that fought everyone else stood quiet for him, and comptroller. The disagreeable Buck, who had gored 2 men and terrorized the county's dogs, followed Torvald around the pen like an aging king with a favored courtier. And within a year, the boy who could not do anything right by his father's measure had become the thing the whole operation depended on. And Delphine paid him a real wage and taught him the notebook and watched him begin, on his own, to make his own entries in a hand as cramped and careful as Alvin's had been. The Vindication, when it finally arrived in full, did not arrive as a triumph. That was the thing Delphine had not expected and could never quite explain afterward. She had imagined in the hard first year some future moment of arrival, some day when the men who doubted her would have to stand in front of the proof and admit it, and she had thought that day would feel like winning. But when it came, it did not feel like winning. It came on an October afternoon in the 4th year, a still gold day near the end of the season, when Brant Hurley's truck came up her drive and Brant himself got out slowly. An old man now, older than the 4 years should have made him, because the drought had finally beaten him the way it beat everyone who had bet on the rain coming back. The syndicate had bought the last of his family ground that summer, cheap, the way Ottilie had said they always did, the way his own grandfather had bought other men's ground cheap in the 30s, the wheel come all the way around. He stood in Delphine's yard with his hat in his hands, and he looked out at the pale field where the herd grazed fat and thriving on the ground he had called worthless, and he did not make a large production out of it. He said, "I told you that ground didn't lead anywhere." He said it quietly, looking at the goats and not at her. And then he said, "I was reading it like it was my ground. I never once read it like it was its own." And Delphine, who had waited 4 years for something like this and found now that she did not want it the way she had thought she would, only nodded and asked him if he wanted coffee. And he did. And they sat on the porch, and he told her, in the halting way of a man unaccustomed to being wrong out loud, that he'd been thinking his grandfather bought that pale ground cheap in the 30s and sold it back to Alvin's father cheaper still, because everyone knew it wouldn't grow corn, and that maybe the not growing corn had been the most valuable thing about it the whole time, if anyone had been patient enough to ask what it would grow instead. He asked her before he left if she had any use for a man who knew the west end of the county better than the back of his own hand, a man who had no ground of his own anymore, but who could still read weather and fix fence and haul feed. And Delphine looked at him for a long beat, the way she looked at everything before she acted, and she thought about her grandfather and the syndicate and the '89 offer and the whole long history of certainty in Sparen County, and she said yes, and she put Brant Hurley to work mending the very fences he had once leaned on to tell her she was wasting her youth, and he did it well, and he never mentioned the doubting again, and neither did she, because there was no profit in it, and she had never been in it for the settling of scores. That winter he brought his grandson out to see the operation and stood at the fence explaining the pale ground to the boy with the fervor of the converted, telling him about the seabed that had lain there before the plains and the minerals in the chalk, and the way the drought that killed everything else was the very thing that made this ground sing. And Delphine, hearing him through the barn wall, wrote it down in the notebook, because it seemed to her a thing worth keeping, the day the county's certainty finally turned over in its sleep and woke up curious. Ottilie lived to see the good years begin, and did not live to see them ripen, which was its own kind of ache Delphine carried quietly. The old woman went the way she had lived without fuss on a January morning in the 5th year, found sitting upright in her chair by the cold stove with her darning in her lap and the wedge of that first successful cheese, the one Delphine had made and Ottilie had pronounced her mother's, sitting on the table beside her half-eaten, saved, apparently, all that time. Delphine did not weep at first. She sat with her grandmother in the cold small house for a long while, and then she went out and did the milking because the animals did not know to grieve, and the milk would not wait. And it was only later, cutting into a fresh wheel in the kitchen and tasting the chalk and the sweet, that she understood she was tasting the thing that connected the 4 generations of women who had worked this pale, wrong ground, Ottilie's mother, who sold stone cheese to a French cook off the railroad, Ottilie, who kept it alive as a private strangeness, Alvin, who wrote the true thing in the notebook and died before he finished it, and herself, who had been quiet enough at last to hear what the field had been trying to say for 100 years. And she wept then, standing at the counter, not from grief alone, but from the enormity of being the point at which all that patience finally arrived. They buried Ottilie beside Alvin at the little cemetery off Nemec Road on a gray day with the whole county there, because the whole county came now, the same men who had shaken their heads at the fence 4 years before, standing hat in hand at the graveside of the woman who had told her granddaughter not to sign. And afterward Rosalind Tackett and Present Vasco and Merle Gaddy and Torvald Acre and even Brant Hurley crowded into the small kitchen and ate the stone cheese and told stories about Ottilie. And Delphine stood in the doorway and watched the thing her grandmother had helped her build fill up the house with people. And she thought that this, more than any magazine paragraph, more than any restaurant in any city she couldn't pronounce, was the harvest. Not the cheese, the people the cheese had gathered back to a place that everyone had been leaving. She found among Ottilie's things that week a letter the old woman had written and never sent, addressed to no one, more a note to herself. And in it, Ottilie had written a single line that Delphine copied into the black notebook beneath her grandfather's line about the wrong soil, a line that became the second half of the thing the family had been trying to say across a century, that read simply, "The ground was never poor. We were just too rich in our expectations to see what it was offering." And Delphine read those two lines together, Alvin's and Ottilie's, the man's and the woman's, and understood that between them they had said the whole truth, and that her only job now was to keep proving it quietly, one season at a time. The expansion, when it finally happened the same way everything else on the Rehnquist place had happened, which was without ceremony and without debt, and pulled forward by a demand she had never once chased. By the 7th year, the stone cheese was known well enough that people planned drives around it, and the little grocery on Delph Street could not be the whole of its distribution. So Delphine did the sensible slow thing, which was to buy back, acre by acre, the pieces of Alvin's original quarter that had been sold off across the decades, the very ground the syndicate had accumulated cheap, and she bought it not with borrowed money but with the cheese itself, wheel by wheel, year by year, and she did not plant corn on it when she got it back. She let it go to the hardy dry plants, and she ran the herd across it, and she watched the pale, wrong, worthless ground of Sparen County, the ground everyone had measured and condemned, become the most productive land on the whole West End, precisely because she had finally stopped asking it to be something it was not. She hired Torvald full-time and made him a partner in everything but name, and she took on 2 more young people from the county who had been about to leave, and she built a proper aging room dug into the same pale clay that had made the original root cellar perfect, expanding the thing that worked instead of replacing it with the thing that scaled. And the cheese stayed good, because the herd stayed known and the ground stayed small enough to walk. The man from the investment fund came back one more time, years later, and made an even larger offer, and Delphine, older now, with gray at her temples and Ottilie's canvas coat on her back, because she had inherited it and saw no reason to insult a coat that still worked, told him no again, in the same kitchen, at the same table, with the same black notebook between them, and this time she did not even bother to explain why, because the answer was written all around him if he had the patience to read it. There is a photograph that ran in a magazine in the 10th year, and in it Delphine Rehnquist is kneeling in the pale field with a handful of the chalk-colored dust running through her fingers, studying it the way another person might study a letter from someone long dead, which was exactly what she had been doing the first afternoon on the last unbroken field before any of it began. And the caption did not know that it was describing a circle closing, that the woman in the photograph was doing in year 10 the identical thing she had done in year 0, holding the dust up to the light and finding worth in it that the whole county had sworn was not there. The only difference being that now the county knew she was right and had known it long enough to have half forgotten it was ever surprised. She kept the notebook still. It had 2 notebooks joined to it now, Alvin's black cloth-bound original and her own that had grown to fill 4 spiral volumes, and Torvald's beginning its own. And on the last written page of the last one she had added, beneath the 2 lines from her grandfather and her grandmother, a 3rd line of her own, so that the family thought would have all 3 of its parts and could be handed forward complete. And it read, "Worth doesn't argue, it waits." She had learned that from the field and from the dust and from the drought that killed everything except the one thing everyone had already thrown away. And she believed it the way she believed in weather, which is to say completely and without any need to say it out loud. If this story reached something in you, do one thing before you go, and pass it along to somebody in your life who has been told that what they have in their hands, their land or their idea or their quiet, stubborn way of doing things, is not worth the trouble, because they may need to hear tonight that worth doesn't argue, it waits. Then leave me a comment and tell me about a time you saw value in something everyone else had written off, or a time somebody underestimated you and reality did the answering for you, because those are the stories I most want to read. And tell me the town and the country you're watching from, the way I asked you at the start, because I mean it when I say I read every single comment that comes in on these, all of them, one at a time, the same patient way Delphine read the dust. Thank you for staying to the end of a slow story. Some things are only worth what you're patient enough to see in them.